Hey, this is Mr. Wistar again. This lesson is about how to override methods when you're using inheritance. It's really part 2 of our unit on inheritance, and if you haven't watched the video on using inheritance, you should definitely watch that first before you come back here. There's not a huge amount of content in this lesson, but it's a continuation of what we talked about last time, and it talks in a little bit more specific detail about what to do with the methods when you inherit them and you choose perhaps to rewrite them. So we'll talk about what inheritance is and how overriding works. And then we'll talk about how you can call the methods that you've overridden, and also how you can choose, if you want to call your parents' methods that you've written code to replace. So just to review, we're talking about inheritance here, which is when you have a class that extends another class. And by doing that, it gets to reuse all of the methods from that parent class for free without having to type them in again. You can just use them as if they're already there. When you inherit from a parent class, remember that the child class can use the methods of the parent class, but it can't touch the variables of the parent class. The only way you can modify your parent class's variables is by using your parent class's methods. And that's a lot of times where we run into the situation of overriding methods and needing to call your parent's method anyway. So we'll get into that. Overriding methods, again, just in case we haven't made that clear enough, is when your child class or your subclass rewrites a method that already exists in your parent class because you want it to behave differently. So, for example, if you had a vehicle class that had a method in it called travel, and then you created a child class called plane, you might want its travel method to behave differently. You might need it to take off first, or you might need it to check the flaps, and then do what vehicle does in travel, or not even reference that parent method at all. But the key here is, in order for you to have a method use overriding, the header of the method, that top line, that public void travel parentheses, the syntax of your method in the child class has to match exactly the syntax of the header in the parent class. Otherwise, Java is going to assume that they're two completely different methods. So make sure that those two methods match. If you get weird behavior or syntax errors, that'd be the first thing that I would check. Because when Java runs your program and it tries to deal with a method call in an object, the way that works is it will first attempt to call whatever method it finds in the code for that class. So if you've rewritten travel in your plane method, it's going to call that travel first. Now, if you call a method for an object that's not defined in that object, then what happens is it tries to find the same method in the parent of that object. And if it doesn't find it in the parent, then it tries to find it in the parent's parent, or the parent's parent's parents. And it keeps working its way all the way up the hierarchy until it gets to that class object, which we know is the ancestor, the great-great-great-great-grandparent of every class in Java. And if the method that you call doesn't exist in object, and it doesn't exist in any class that you inherit from, then that's when you get a compiler error saying unidentified identifier. So if you get that syntax error too, that ought to be a clue for you that maybe you messed up the syntax of your overriding method. Okay, again, make sure that you match the syntax of the first line of that method exactly to what you have in your parent method. Usually what I'll do is I'll just copy and paste the method from my parent class into my child class and then erase what I have in the curly braces. Because most of the time your comments are the same, and the first line of the method, of course, has to be the same. And then once you've done that, just write your new code inside the curly braces. You can do whatever you want to in the curly braces, as long as you don't need to touch any class variables that you inherited from your parent. Remember, in that case, you still have to use methods from your parent class in order to do that. Last point, and then we'll look at an example, has to do with choosing which method you call when it's time to use these methods and you've been using overriding. Again, the way we've explained it is that when you go to call a method on an object, it's going to call the method that is defined inside that object's class type. But sometimes you don't want that, or sometimes you need to use a method of your parent. And if you want to do that, there is a syntactical way to do that. You can put the word super in front of the name of the method. And what that tells Java is that I don't want to use my method, I want to use my parent's method. And that can be really useful if, for whatever reason, the behavior that you want the object to follow is the behavior in the parent method. And actually, a really common use for this, which we'll see in a minute, is if you're trying to override a method, but you still want to reuse the same behavior that your parent method uses, then the easiest way to do that is to just call super with that method name and then do your extra work. So that's a lot better than copying and pasting the code from your parent's method, because then you've got code in two places and maybe you want to change it later. Okay, let's see an example of that. So we're going to go back to the same example from the last lesson. We've got our bank account class from chapter 10. In our bank account class, we have two methods called deposit and withdraw. But in our checking account, the checking account needs to keep track of how many transactions there are, because, I don't know, maybe your bank charges for how many checks you write every month. Well, in order to do that, let's say we were going to write deposit, for example. We still want to deposit money in our account. So the method that exists in bank account is fine. We just have to do extra work. And you'll see an example of that right here. If you look in the deposit method, we increment the value of transaction and count, and then we just call super.deposit with the same exact parameter. That's an example of using super to force your program to call your parent's method. If you forgot to use super, of course, well then you'd be doing recursion by accident. You don't want to do that. So remember the stuff that we talked about in this lesson. Overriding a method means rewriting the contents of a method that has the same header as one of your parent's methods. And you can do that for any method that you inherit from your parent class. You can even call your parent class's inherited method by using super in front of the name of that. Alright, you're all set.